Hi, everybody. I'm David Capes with the Stone Chapel Podcast. Mike Licona joins me today to talk about a new book that he's written entitled Jesus Contradicted, Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. It's published by Zondervan Academic Press. Now, the Stone Chapel Podcast is part of the Church Leaders Podcast Network. We're produced in Houston, Texas, by the great people at the Lanier Theological Library. Our mission is to resource church leaders and academics as well in order to help them face the complexities of ministry today. Now, the Church Leaders Podcast Network is supporting pastors and ministry leaders by challenging some of the assumptions that we have about, in this case, maybe the Bible, or providing insights and offering some practical steps that are going to help church leaders navigate a variety of cultures and contexts. You can learn more about it at ChurchLeaders.com/podcast network. Let's hear from our founder, Dr. Ed Stetzer, out there at Biola University.
You know, it's a changing world, and one of the things that help us understand the changing world is research. And so as churches have been struggling and families may be disconnected and sometimes drifting away from the church, we're kind of dealing with some of the questions of where do we go from here? And the Communio nationwide survey on faith and relationships really kind of points to the family decline and how it relates to faith decline in the United States. Actually, the survey has 3 key issues that are impacting our society today. Go to communio.org/study to download the nationwide study on faith and relationships.
Thanks, Ed. This is Mike Licona's first appearance on the Stone Chapel Podcast. His book tackles a thorny issue. Why do the New Testament Gospels tell the same stories, but they do so in a different order sometimes and in a different way? It's an important book, and if you have avid Bible readers in your congregation, they're bound to notice. So this is going to be an important conversation. So today, scholar, writer, speaker, apologist, and professor Mike Licona on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
My name is Mike Licona, and I'm professor of New Testament Studies at Houston Christian University.
Dr. Mike Licona. Mike, good to see you. Welcome to the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Oh, thanks so much. It's great to see you again, David.
Yes.
Appreciate you very much in what you do and your scholarship.
You're kind to say that. I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while. I'm glad we've got a great excuse, which is a great book called Jesus Contradicted. We'll be talking about in a few minutes. Now, there are people out there who are in Africa and South America, listen to the podcast, Australia. They may not know who Mike Licona is. So for those who don't know, who is Mike Licona?
Well, I'm 63 years old. I grew up in Baltimore, Maryland, and became a Christian at the age of 10. Started to get doubts about my faith when I was in grad school. It wasn't really anything I'd learned. It was just me thinking, how do I know that what I believe is true? I believe I've got this relationship with the Lord. I was praying 1 hour to 2 hours a day, feeling a closeness and intimacy with God, studying Scripture several hours a day in the original language of Greek in the New Testament. But I just got thinking, am I deluding myself for some reason? If I've been brought up in Afghanistan, would I be a Muslim? Would I have been brought up in India? Would I be a Hindu? If I'd been brought up in China, would I be an atheist? One of my roommates suggested that I see Gary Habermas, a Christian philosopher and apologist, so I did. And he really helped me through my doubts by pointing me to the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. And that led me into doing a doctoral program research on the resurrection of Jesus. I wanted to investigate it using the tools of a historian to see if we really approach this thing in a fair-minded manner, looking really, really at the evidence. The evidence and historical method, would it really support the conclusion that Jesus rose from the dead?
A lot of that research is later published, right?
It was in the pretty large book, The Resurrection of Jesus, A New Historiographical Approach by IVP Academic.
Yeah. This book, Jesus Contradicted, is a really interesting book. I finished reading it a little earlier. The subtitle is Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. I thought that was interesting. That tells a lot about the book, why the Gospels tell the same story differently. All right, take us through, what is the big idea, Mike, of your book?
Well, anyone who's a serious reader of the Gospels will notice that they do tell the same story differently often. So, for example, Jesus' baptism is reported in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Mark and Luke say that when Jesus came up out of the water, God's voice spoke out of heaven and said, "You are my beloved Son. With you I am well pleased." So God is directly addressing Jesus. But Matthew, who's probably relying on Mark as his source, as most scholars think, and Matthew wasn't even around as a disciple at that point anyway, he reports God's voice from heaven saying, "This is my beloved Son. With him I am well pleased." In Matthew's gospel, God is directly addressing the crowd, the onlookers.
The audience there, right, yeah.
Yeah. So I think St. Augustine was correct when he said that Matthew changed the recipient who God was speaking to in order to make God's message that Jesus is his son more personable to his readers. That makes perfect sense. The other option is you try to harmonize it and say, well, God said both. Well, if you want to do that, congratulations. Now you agree with the gospel of the Ebionites written in the 2nd century. So there are a whole lot of differences like this. And over the years, many Christians, the default approach has been to attempt to harmonize these differences. But a lot of times these harmonization become strained approaches that I like to talk about being as like hermeneutical waterboarding the text until they tell you what you want to hear.
Oh, no.
And that's just not to respect the text. So I thought there's a better way. Well, as you're well aware, as a prominent New Testament scholar, most New Testament scholars today regard the Gospels as being ancient biographies.
Yeah.
And ancient biographies took some liberties in the way that they reported the details. So they were okay in bending some of the details in order to make a point a little more clearly, like Matthew does with the baptism.
The voice
and
from heaven.
many other examples that are even far more radical than that. If we read the Gospels through the lens of first century biography and understand the kind of techniques or compositional devices that the ancient biographers, writers, were actually taught and instructed to do when they learned how to write well during their mid-teens, well, then all of a sudden, reading the Gospels through that lens, a whole lot more comes into focus, and more than 90% of the differences in the Gospels just melt away.
Today, if you read a biography of Winston Churchill, there are going to be certain ideas that a biographer will try to convey. But in the ancient world, they're doing biography, the idea of biography, but they're doing it a different way. What are some of those differences? You talk about those compositional details. They're taking a little liberty here or there. How does that work? How would you compare the modern biography to an ancient biography?
Okay, I'll give you an example here. The genealogies of Matthew and Luke. A lot of times people try to reconcile these and say, well, one is the genealogy of Jesus through Mary, the other through Joseph. That doesn't work. And there's numerous reasons for that. You have in Matthew chapter 1, verse 17, it says, these are all the generations. And then it goes, it's 14 generations from, I think, Abraham to David, 14 from David to the deportation to Babylon, and 14 from the deportation to Jesus. 3 sets of 14. But if you look at that same time period and the generations that you have listed in Luke's gospel, there are more than the 42. And then what's interesting is in the second set of the 14, Matthew ends with Jeconiah, and then he kind of cheats because the first name in the third set is Jeconiah. So it's like he's not even trying to be exhaustive or extremely careful here. So what's going on? Well, a number of scholars, I think they're correct on this, is that Matthew is using a Hebrew rhetorical device known as gematria, where he assigns a numerical value to a letter. We find this in Psalm 119, where each chapter is giving, each psalm, section of that psalm is assigned a letter in the Hebrew alphabet. So it's interesting when you look at the word David, you have a Dalet, a D, which is the fourth letter in the Hebrew alphabet,
That's
Vav, which
four.
is the sixth letter, and then another Dalet, because there's no valves, right? So you have 464 or 14. As numerous scholars have acknowledged, you have Matthew here saying on three occasions, for emphasis, artistically, that Jesus is the son of David, the
Yep.
Messiah.
Yep. Yep.
So he's painting a literary portrait of Jesus. Were those generations involved in Jesus's line? Yes. But he's not trying to be exhaustive. He's not even trying to be extremely careful. He's more concerned about painting this literary portrait of Jesus as the son of David, the Messiah.
And just punctuating that, because at the very beginning, Matthew 1:1, this is the genesios, this is the origin of Jesus, the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. So he's just punctuating those. That's fantastic, yeah. So that's how ancient biography does. What about modern biography? How would you compare that? What do you see when you look at a modern biography?
Well, the objective of modern biography in telling the story, they want to tell how the person came to develop the character, the inward character that they have. Was it, their social, cultural backgrounds, their education, what led them to that? Ancient biography, the ancients did not look at that in that way. They assumed that the person was born with the kind of character and it just manifested itself over the years. So according to Plutarch, and the most famous passage in all of Plutarch's writings, his Life of Alexander, chapter 1, he's saying that through what the person said and did, he's going to illuminate the kind of person that this is, their moral character, ethics, who they actually are. So, David, it's really interesting. When you come to the Gospels and you read them through this lens, it is so eye-opening. It's amazing. When I saw it the first time, I just leapt out of my seat.
Wow.
You
Wow.
come and you start off the beginning of Mark's Gospel, and what does he say? As Isaiah the prophet said, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, prepare the way of the Lord, make his path straight. Well, you would think that it's Jesus preparing the way for God, but no, it's John the Baptist preparing the way for Jesus.
Exactly.
Well, what's that saying about who Jesus is? It's saying he's God.
Right.
Then you come to chapter 2. Jesus heals a paralytic and forgives him his sins. And the Jewish leaders say, well, that's blasphemy. Only God can forgive sins.
Yeah.
Chapter 3, you've got Jesus who calms the wind and the storm, right? Well, the Old Testament says that's something God does. He calms the wind. Chapter 4, you got Jesus casting out demons, and they say, well, only it's Satan casting out Satan. And then Jesus gives that word picture where he says, if you want to go and rob a strong man, you got to bind him first, and then you can go in his house and plunder his goods. Well, what he's saying by that is his exorcisms, he is binding the strong man who is Satan and now is plundering souls from his kingdom. Well, what human can bind Satan? And then he walks on water in chapter 6, which is the Old Testament says God does that. Then he raises the dead, something the Old Testament says only God does. And then you see what Jesus, his sayings throughout the Gospel of Mark. It's like almost every chapter has something that Jesus says or does where Mark is pointing it out to illustrate he is deity. And this is something you see when you read the Gospels through the lens of ancient biography that's not so clear when you read it through a 21st century lens.
So when you talk about ancient biography, okay, so we've got the Gospels as examples of ancient biography. What other kind of examples have you looked into in all of your studies?
One of my favorite ones is the cursing of the fig tree and the cleansing of the temple, okay? So we find a couple of these compositional devices occurring here. So these stories, both of them are found in Mark and in Matthew. So in Mark's account, you have Jesus entering Jerusalem, Palm Sunday, and he goes into Jerusalem. He enters the temple. It's late in the day. He looks around. He leaves the temple, goes to Bethany, and spends the night. Monday, he's returning to Jerusalem. He's hungry. They come to a fig tree, nothing on it, so he curses it. It's still Monday. He goes into the temple, doesn't like what he sees, cleanses the temple. Then he goes back to Bethany, spends Monday night in Bethany. Tuesday morning, gets up, returning to Jerusalem, sees the fig tree. It's already withered and died. Now, Matthew, he compresses things. He rides in on Palm Sunday, goes into the temple, doesn't like what he sees. So what Matthew does now is he conflates, he combines the Sunday visit with the Monday visit. In the two become now one visit, conflation. And he cleanses the temple on Sunday. Then they leave the temple, they go and they spend the night in Bethany, just as they did in Mark. Monday morning he gets up, he's returning to Jerusalem, he's hungry, he sees the fig tree, he curses it, and Matthew says immediately it withers and dies. He takes the two steps of cursing it one day, seeing it dead the next, that we find in Mark. He conflates them, compresses them together to occur on a single occasion so that it withers before their very eyes. So I'd like to reckon this as something like today, I call it the difference between the guy version and the girl version of a story. And just about all of us who are married can understand this. It's stereotyping, of course, and there are many exceptions, but it is largely true, and most of us can understand. You know, women like to tell details. They want to tell precisely what happened, where it happened, when it happened, why it happened, how it happened, who was there, what they were doing, what they were thinking, what they were saying, what they were wearing, and how they were feeling. But as guys, it's like, you know, we'll bend the details a little, just get to the bottom line. The game's coming on in 5 minutes. Well, Matthew gives us the guy version of the story. Mark gives us the girl version of the story.
Well, you got that telescoping. That's what I've always referred to as telescoping. You take that which is kind of a long thing and you pull it down and you just condense it in a way. So if somebody wanted to look at ancient biography, let's say Plutarch, would that be a good place to start?
Oh, it'd be an excellent place. Plutarch is such a great writer. He wrote more than 60 biographies, of which 48 have survived. Most of those you can read in about 3 hours. And they are so good. He is such a good writer. He's known as the greatest ancient biographer. And we know a lot about the ancient world from Plutarch. You get into some other biographers, probably Suetonius, who wrote almost contemporaneous, within just a few years of Plutarch, and a lot of overlap between them. He's considered to be the greatest Roman biographer, and he writes more like we do today. But he's quite dry in comparison to Plutarch. Plutarch is a very good read.
Were these guys trying to entertain? Were they trying to inspire? What were they doing with their biography?
Well, it's to be educational, it's to be inspiring, and yes, it's to be entertaining as well. Ancient biographers and historians were expected to write good literature. Now, there's one ancient writer named Asconius who writes just like historians do today. And most people will have never heard of Asconius because the ancients didn't preserve everything he wrote because it just didn't interest them as much.
It was kind of flat, huh?
Yeah.
Flat and uninteresting. Part of the book is very conversational. You do a wonderful job writing that part. And you tell the story about the naivete with which you, at one point, came to Scripture. I know that actually it's the reading of Scripture, the engaging of Scripture, that leads you to these questions and leads you to these, in your case, trying to give an account for what you find there.
You know, it's like when I was learning Greek, you know, I learned how to pronounce it, and then I'm reading the Greek New Testament and some words of Jesus, and I'm thinking, wow, this is just how he sounded. I didn't think at the time, he was probably speaking in Aramaic, and we're reading a Greek translation of it. And by the way, we don't even exactly know how the ancient Greek sounded anyway.
That's true,
and,
yeah.
You know, because the Gospels do differ in the way they report the words, in many cases aren't his precise words. They're how he was remembered to say these things. They are communicating an essentially faithful representation of what he said, but these are not likely to be transcripts of what he said. It's not to put doubt in our mind, because he would have repeated the same kind of stuff over and over. They would have heard these things hundreds of times. But that's not to say that he said the exact same words each time, any more that when you teach a course, that you're going to use the exact precise words and precise order every time. But we could still get an essentially faithful representation, a very accurate gist of what David Capes said.
It's a terrific book. It's entitled Jesus Contradicted, and the subtitle, Why the Gospels Tell the Same Story Differently. Dr. Michael Licona, Thanks for being with us today on the Stone Chapel Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Mike Licona has an incredible focus and reach. Look forward to having him back. Thanks to Kathy Capes, Jessica Mauser, Phil Keggy, and Jenna Firestone for helping us produce this podcast. It's just part of what we do here at the Lanier Theological Library and Learning Center and at the Church Leaders Podcast Network. If you like what you hear on this podcast, please tell a friend. And the next time you're in Houston, pay us a visit. It's a little bit of Oxford itself in Northwest Houston. Till next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.
You know, if you listen to the podcast, you know that I love research. I used to lead a research company. So I love when research helps to illustrate a question we have. And one of the questions a lot of people are having is, how do we look to the decline of the family, maybe the relationship around fatherhood and issues of faith and church? Well, again, the Communio nationwide study on faith and relationships actually points to the collapse of marriage, where resident fatherhood fits into that, and how they all point ultimately to a relationship to Christianity and decline in the church. So visit communio.org/study to download Communio's nationwide study on faith and relationships.